And recording now. Today is Thursday, the 5th of July, 2018. This is the regularly scheduled meeting, lecture, whatever, for ITSE 2309 in Collin College in Frisco, Texas, although I'm in Denton. Today we're going to be discussing, I'll be introducing to you Module 8, which is the is the idea of the subquery, and I'm going to develop what we're talking about there. Let me talk just a minute about the SQL syntax. On SQL syntax, SQL will allow you to skip a lot of the syntax, although I don't want you to do this. It will allow you to drop the, for example, if I say select vendor name as VN, it would be, you can shorten this to select vendor name with no comma between vendor name and VN. So instead of as, you just drop it and leave a space. Personally, I think it's better to go ahead and use the full syntax. The terms inner and outer may be skipped, and many of our presentations, they do so. Many teachers present the full syntax. I present the full syntax, and I would like for you to do it. Thus, this query that says, select vendor name as vendor space name. Now, note that these square brackets are only required if you have a space in the alias name. SQL Server will allow you to name fields with spaces in the field name, but I strongly discourage that practice. Simply because many of them will not. Just because Access and SQL Server allow you to do it doesn't mean that it should be done. If you want to put spaces in the alias, there's no particular reason you can't, but then there's no particular reason to put it there either, and it causes you to have to put it in these delimiters. Some platforms will allow you to delimit it with quotes, single quotes. I recommend just not putting spaces in anything. There's no reason to put spaces in there. So as vendor name, comma, account description, as account description, as line count, vendors inner join invoices, inner join invoice line items, inner join accounts. And we could shorten that to, we could drop the as's, say vendor name, space, vendor name, comma, account description, space, its alias, comma, count, asterisk, space, line count. And then from vendors V, you could just say join. I will not be happy if you write an inner join like this. Similarly, you can write, instead of left outer join, you can usually get away with just simply saying left join. I will not be happy if you write it that way. So I'm going to say they support this, the SQL platforms support the syntax, and I don't know that all of them do, but most of them do. Therefore, I'm going to go ahead and insist on the full syntax. Now, there's nothing wrong with shortening the syntax, and if you choose to do so later, I suppose that's your business. SQL tends to get a little bit verbose, unlike C, which tends to be terse. So just a word on the syntax. I would like to see us go ahead and use the full, A left outer join B, table A, left outer join table B, instead of a left join. Although the book sometimes does this in their examples. They mean the same thing, and you can get away with it in SQL Server. I'm not so sure that it will work in all platforms, though. Questions? That should be pretty straightforward. Okay, subqueries. There's a pretty good one of Dr. King's lectures that lets you hear somebody besides me giving the lecture on it. Notice that if you look carefully right here, you'll see that Dr. King says from customers C left join orders O. So I would have written that from customers as C left outer join orders as O. But each to each his own. Okay. Consider an SQL selection. Okay, all of the vendors' names who have no associated invoices. All of the vendors' names with no associated invoices. And say, okay, what do I need in this table? Gee, I'm asking stuff about two tables. So I'm going to need in this query, I'm going to have the vendors, obviously, because I'm asking for the vendor's name. And I'm going to have the invoices. And the question is, are they directly related? And the answer is yes, they are. So I only need two tables in this query. And we recognize that this is what we call the childless parent query. In other words, unassociated. They're not associated with anything. There's nothing wrong with a childless parent, but this is called an outer join. So I want to find records that are not associated. What tables are needed? Vendors and invoices. How are they related? Vendor ID. From which table comes the unmatched rows? The answer is the ones I want come from the vendor's table. So I want them from the vendor's table that are not in the invoices table. And it's pretty straightforward. We thought about it. We're ready to write the table. And I believe I have it over here. So select vendor name, vendors as the left outer join invoices. So the join we say is pointing to the table where from which our information comes. So it's pointing to the vendors table. Had I put the vendors over here, if I'd said invoices as I right outer join vendors, I would have accomplished the same thing. Basically, the outer join points to the table from which my information comes. There's the join field, and where the invoice is null. And if I were to execute this query, I find that I have, Byman, can you see this okay?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Okay. I find that I have 91 rows in my output. And so this is just a plain old outer join, plain old find the parents who have no children. I've got more vendors that don't have invoices than I do that have invoices. There's another way of thinking here. Now there's nothing in the world wrong with this. It's fine. And lots of people will think this way, but this particular query, everything that is selected for return comes from a single table. Okay, so when I'm in this world, I have another way to write it. That I can write it this way if I want to, or in case where I ask you to write it as a subquery, I can think about it as a subquery. Now, I want the vendor name from vendors where the vendor ID is not in. Select vendor ID from invoices. Now, think about this idea for just a moment. The in query, I think, believe we have discussed in. It's either in this set or it's not. So is the vendor ID in this set? Now, these parentheses are required. So where the vendor ID is not in this set, everything that's here, but not here. Does that make sense? So if I execute this query, here it is in my window. I'm going to execute him now. Again, I get 91 rows, the same 91 rows. I don't know why I'm tabbed over so far. I usually use one tab inside there. Now, it is my practice to do this. I write the select, then I say not in, and then I open my parentheses at the margin, close the parentheses right below where I open it, and everything inside of there is tabbed over one tab. So if I had another one in there, and I can easily have these things nested deeply. I personally like to use subselects. To me, they make more sense. I don't know if they make more sense than a table join, but they essentially, this is an outer join. It would be the same thing if I say, show me all the vendor names that have associated invoices. In that case, instead of not in, it would just become a straight in. So this shows me all the ones that have children. Notice I have 32 of them that have children. And I believe I have one in there that's invalid.
Question.
Go ahead.
Do we have written that as join with invoices using not in, not as a subquery?
If you're going to write it as a join, it would either be an inner join or an outer join, okay. And it would look like this. So I could write it as an inner join. In that case, it would show me the ones that had children. The tricky part, so this one would be an inner join. So this one would be like copy.
So the first example was not a subquery. It didn't need a subquery.
I don't know about didn't need a subquery. This one right here, so this is as a join. So this particular one is just does an inner join. I want to see all of the vendors that have invoices. So if I execute that, what am I? Select distinct. Okay, so select distinct vendor name, if I were to do it that way. So here I got my 32 rows, because I got a lot of duplicates in this one. And it's the same thing as this one. Select vendor name where a vendor ID is in this guy. Now, the difference here is that I can pull another field. So if I want to see something about vendors, so I want to see the vendor name and their associated vendor IDs, okay? I could say this one, it would be very easy. I just add the vendor ID to the select. Here, I can't put vendor ID. I can't add the vendor ID into this one. Why? Because I can't see in this outer query, vendor ID is not there. I don't know why it's not giving me a red line yet. It will get around to it in a minute. As soon as I try to execute it, no, vendor ID. Vendor ID I can, because vendor ID comes from the vendors table. Let's invoice. if I want to see the invoice ID with it, I can't. Notice it's giving me the red mark on it, and it's not a valid column name because it's not in the vendors table. And in this outer query, the only thing I can see is the vendors table. So this guy right here, I simply cannot have that invoice ID in there. Up here in the inner join, I could ask for the invoice ID very easily. And it would give me the invoice ID with it. This one, I can't get the invoice ID. So the sub-select is limited in its use, and I point that out here. In this particular query, everything that is selected for return comes from a single table. And anytime I'm in that world where it all comes from a single table, now I'm in the world where I can use it as a subquery very easily. Some observations here. Let's see if I can blow that up a little bit bigger.
Can I point out another thing?
Yeah.
Okay, going up that query with the inner join, where v vendor ID is equal to I vendor ID.
Yeah, that's the join field, the join condition. Yes.
Underneath that, where I vendor ID is null, can both two lines be satisfied? Because if I vendor ID is null, it will never be equal to v vendor ID.
Yes. That because of the property of the outer join is going to give us everything from the table that it's pointed at, in this case the left one. So everything comes from the vendor's table, whether it equals the I.vendor ID or not. Okay. And where the I.vendor ID is null is the one I'm interested in. Okay. So it's going to give me everything. If I did not do that, okay. For example, I executed it just the part without that. Well,
then we get the whole thing.
I'm going to get the whole potato, yeah. And so I have 203 rows.
Yeah. Okay, I understand now. I understand.
And if I were to print the vendor ID, I would see lots of nulls in there. So I'm really only interested in where the vendor ID is null. I'm seeing all of the invoices and all of the nulls also, but I'm only interested, most of the time I'm interested in the nulls. Okay. So most of the time this outer join points in one direction or the other. So it points to the table I want to get the information from, and then the null typically points to the other one, because that's usually what I'm interested in. Okay. Not always, but usually.
And when there is subqueries, that subqueries is worked first, right?
Well, yes, it does actually. The subquery comes first because you go down inside this parentheses and you do this one. You don't know really what it's going to choose to do with it. It's free to do anything. The query optimizer is free to say, oh, you didn't really want a subquery, and it'll do a table join. It's free to do it however it can do it the best. And you really don't know how it's going to do. You can find out, but bottom line is the SQL is an artificial intelligence language, and all you're really doing is specifying what you want the answer to look like. Okay, so I want the answer to look like this. I want all the vendor names that don't have invoices. So this is one way to specify that. Here is another way to specify the same thing. I don't know which one will run better. Syntax requires these parentheses are not optional. Some people believe that a subquery is more intuitive than an outer join, or an inner join for that matter. I personally like it better. In general, a subquery is not any more or any less efficient than a table join. You may use them as you please, unless I ask you to use a subquery. Professor King did raise a good point in the video. Do not use the distinct. Do not say select distinct vendor ID. in the subquery. The vendor ID makes it, the distinct makes it less efficient because it's either in this set or it's not in this set, and we don't care if it's in there twice. Doesn't bother us at all. Questions? Let's go to the next. Okay, a subquery is very handy for finding a maximum or a minimum value. For example, find the vendor ID or vendor IDs with the highest invoice total. First of all, well, we could use a group by. Let's do a group by. Now, I have kludged my data a little bit. Your data won't look like this, but I'm going to run this query. Here we go. Select vendor ID, max invoice total. From invoices, group by vendor ID, order by ITOT, invoice total. Reason I renamed it was because it's the subject of an aggregate. And remember our new rule. What do I have? I have an aggregate function from the last module. Here's an aggregate function. Here's a non-aggregate function. What has to be true about that non-aggregate function?
Yeah.
Has to be grouped by, yeah. Okay, so let's run this guy. Now you're going to see if you run him on and you haven't changed your data, I'm going to have to go back and run my create AP, but you can change your data anytime you want. Notice that I have 2 rows. I have 2 rows, vendor ID 72 and vendor ID 110, that tied for the maximum invoice total, having a maximum invoice total. Now they got other invoice totals, but that's their greatest one, and they both tied at $37,966.19. And they did that because I went in and changed my data to make them do that. Yours won't do that. So I have 2 of them. Now, I could do this and I could refer you here to this and say, just go look at the output and you'll see which one is the highest because it's ordered by this, and I'm guaranteed that the winners will be right at the very top. But this is kind of sloppy in the world of computer science. So this is better. And this is really the meat. Whenever you have this question, this is what you want for a the subselect answers it this one very easily. Select vendor ID and invoice total from invoices where invoice total is in. Select max invoice total from invoices. So that subquery logically runs first, and we go and find the maximum, and then we go through the invoices and we find the ones where the invoice total matches that maximum. If I execute this, I'm going to see I get both of the ones that I want. And if I had 3 of them that tied, or 4 of them, or 100 of them that tied, I would get the full 100 of them. I don't know how many I'm going to have that tie for the maximum. I know that if I have any records in there at all, I will have at least 1 record that is the maximum, given that I have any invoice totals at all. But I don't know how many I will have. Maybe they're all the same. Could be. Questions? This has a couple of little corollaries. I want to find do I have any that are average? Chances are very good I'm not going to have any, because as soon as I execute this, I probably won't have any. Why? Have you ever met anybody that was average? You calculate the average, and that's a number, that's a real number, a number with a lot of decimal points on it, and it's very likely that nobody will have exactly that number. So typically what I will do on that is say where invoice total is greater than or less than let's say greater than, select greater than average. Now, these 19 rows show me the ones whose the vendor IDs whose invoice totals, the invoices where is greater than the average invoice. Now, notice here that I can have two invoices from the same vendor, two different invoices from the same vendor ID. So 122 appears multiple times here. Okay. 4 or 5 times. So 122 apparently has fairly high invoices. So I've got 19 rows where it is greater than. Let's look at less than. So I want to see where the invoice totals are less than. And notice I have 94 rows. So I have 19 rows that are greater than average and 94 rows that are less than average. What does this tell me about the numbers that are in this table?
It's uniformly distributed.
What's that?
It is uniformly distributed, uniform distribution.
I would tend to say that they are not uniformly distributed. I have 19 that are above and 94 rows that are below average. This tells me that those 19 that are above average are way above average. And that tells me I have 94, well, consider it, let's look at it, so some grades, for example. I have some grades that are running, or some scores on something. Let's don't say grades, but there's just scores. And your score is 5 and 3 and 2 and 9 and 7. I guess we're talking about golf scores here. And then somebody comes along here and they have a score of 98. Well, that's really going to skew that average up a little bit, but there's only one person in the whole group that has a score above average. But that score is so great that it skews the data. So these data are skewed. Okay, let's talk about in my next slide, I talk about this.
One quick question about the data.
Go ahead.
Each on the invoice table, there is a record, and that record, one field is invoice total?
Yes, there is a field called invoice total in the invoices.
Okay, so every vendor ID will have one record in invoice table.
No, a vendor ID can have more than one invoice associated with it. In fact, most vendor IDs do have. For example, if you go look at vendor ID number 122, it has multiple invoices associated with that vendor ID. There's nothing wrong with that. It's vendor ID is the parent. A parent is associated with 0 or more invoices.
Okay, so invoice total is each record has an invoice total number. So when we
yes, indeed, each invoice has a field called invoice total.
Okay, and when we do the average, do you add them all up for one vendor or for all the vendors?
For this, yes, good question. This one right here, this just says average. So this is just all of, not vendors, invoices.
all the invoices, that means all the vendors, all the invoices.
Right. If I were to execute this query right here, and then this is the nice thing about a subquery, I can execute just the subquery, and I can see that the average invoice total is $2,033, I guess, and 76 cents, rounding to the penny.
Okay.
So that's just a number. Now we're going to come back to that invoice total. And I'm going to say that this is a poor design because when you get right down to it, the invoice total is the sum of the invoice line items. It's kind of like hard coding your the invoice total comes from someplace else, and the invoice total should not appear in the invoices table. I'm going to talk about that later when we get down to the design of it, that this was a bad decision on somebody's part early on and what we could do to fix it. We should not have this invoice total in the invoices field, because if you go look over, if the invoice line items has an invoice line item amount on there, and the invoice total is the sum of the invoice line items. So if the invoice line items change, now I have to go in manually and change the that. But I don't really want to talk about that right now. Okay. Okay. Here's what I want to talk about. Select vendor ID invoice total from invoices. So everything up here on this line comes from the invoices table, where the invoice total is in this. Okay. What about equal to? If I were to run this, if I were to execute this, I'm going to get on a soapbox here. So get ready. I'm about to rant and rave. Notice that it works. It gives me the answers. Vendor ID 110, vendor ID 72, where you'll only get the first one unless you've changed your data. What about equal to? What is invoice total? What kind of a thing is it?
Is it number?
It's a number. Thank you. It's an integer. It's a quantity of money, and you say, well, it's not really an integer because it has a decimal point, but that's okay. Anytime you fix the decimal point, it turns into an integer, because I'm never going to think of money in my database. I'll never represent money as $10.33. I will always represent that as 1,033 cents. So anytime that you lock that decimal place in, I'm going to shift it out and treat it as an integer. Okay, so much for that. That's money. That's just a number. What is this? Select max invoice total from invoices.
Well, that is also average number.
My observation here, though, Byman, is that it is not a number. That is a table that contains one number. Now, they are not the same thing. One of those is a number. One of them is a table that contains a number. But the SQL will work this way, but it is logically, in my opinion, an error to say equal to here, because we don't really mean equal to. What we mean is the invoice total in that set. So that is the more accurate way to say it, where this is in that set. Now, if you say equal to, what would happen if this had more than one value in it? Well, now we have a problem. So n will work on any of them. Equal to only works when it returns exactly one number. And so I always use, when I'm testing equality, is this in that set, I never say equal to, I'll always say n. Now let's go down to this one. Oh, I believe what we had greater than. Greater than, where invoice total is greater than the average. Well, this works for the same way, same reason, the same way. The invoice total is money. This is a set that contains one number derived from the average. Therefore, it's going to work, but it is a poor idea. Right? So this will work. This will give me the ones that are greater than average. There are 19 of them. But it is better, and the book mentions this, but it doesn't just say greater than all, where the invoice total is greater than all that are in this set. So that means that the invoice total has to be greater than everything. Well, if there's only one thing in there, greater than or greater than all means exactly the same thing. And again, I got the same 19 rows. So whenever you use greater than or less than, it is better to say greater than or less than. You can also say greater than or equal to all, instead of just straight greater than. You also have another operator that I almost never use. I don't recall ever having used it, and I can say greater than any. And if you think about it, if this were to have returned more than one value, then greater than all and greater than any would give me different returns. So greater than all means it has to be greater than everything in this set. Greater than any means it's greater than at least one thing in this set.
Now, if we run this subquery that you have here, I think you should get only one record, right?
This subquery will give me only one return value, yes.
Okay, that means it is a table with one record that has one number, and that's what it is comparing with.
Yes.
Okay.
And when it is like that, you can say greater than, less than, equal to. It is best if you do not. It is best if you say, instead of equal to or not equal to, you say in or not in. And instead of greater than, you say greater than all, less than all. And if it's just one record, that's fine. It'll do the same thing. It would be possible. We could, for example, we could get the first standard deviation, find everyone that is in the first standard deviation. We might do that if we have time to fool with it. I'm 40, goodness, it's 643.
Is there a standard deviation function?
Yes, there is. And if you know what standard deviation is, you can figure out how to use it. So you say greater than the greater than, select average minus the standard deviation, and less than, select average plus a standard deviation.
Range.
Yeah, you give it a range. And that's very important, because lots of times you'll be asking for, show me everything that's in the first standard deviation. So statistically, that's asked for quite frequently. And I might, I'm not really set up and ready to do that today for an example, but I'll be happy to do that on Tuesday for you. We can talk about, I'll be happy to talk about standard deviation. It's pretty simple. Well, I don't know that it's simple, but it's pretty straightforward as far as the computer to calculate it. And it's very commonly used. So it's a STDDEV, I believe, STDDEV. I'll have to look it up to make sure I've got the right syntax instead of just sitting here fishing for it. But I've used it quite often. questions? Okay, let's see. That's my soapbox. Okay, page 3 is where I talk about in versus equal to. Here's the greater than, less than, and then I talk about the all. This is mentioned in the textbook. No. Okay, any and some are mentioned, but it's very rarely used. Oh, now the fun begins. I'm going to skip for right now. I'm going to skip page 4, correlated subqueries, because they are where students tend to have problems. So I'm going to come back to that, and I'm going to do all of next Tuesday. I'm going to stick with that all on next Tuesday. And so I'm going to skip over that page for right now, and I'm going to talk about derived tables, and this is the text, page 200 and page 201. We can have a subquery that is not defined. So we've seen the subquery so far derived in the where clause. A subquery, written in the where clause. A subquery can also appear in the from clause. So I can select from a subquery. What is a subquery? A subquery is a table. A query, a select from where query is a table. Therefore, I can have a select from where query that selects from this table. So this table right here it's a table. Select vendor ID, vendor name, max payment total as my max. From vendors, enter join invoices, group by, and all that stuff. So if I were to, let me go ahead and bring this one over to my execution table. And we'll get him down. Okay, I think I've got him all on the. Can you see that okay, Byman?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Okay, so notice that I've got a subquery. Now, where's this subquery? The subqueries that we've been looking at so far, the subqueries have been down here in the from. So, or excuse me, in the where. So select something from some table and the where. Now the subquery is used here to decide which rows to view. The subquery can also come up here in the from clause. So what is this thing right here, this guy? That is a table. Can I select from that table? Yes, I can. So I can execute this query and take a look at it. Let's see what it does when I do that. Bang, and I get this. So this is the one that this is what it returns. It returns the vendor ID, the vendor name, and the maximum payment total. Now this one has to have a table join in him. Why does he have to have a table join? Because the request is for the payment total. If all I needed was the vendor ID, vendor name, I don't need a join, but this one asks for the payment total. Therefore, I have to have vendors and invoices. And since I have the max payment total, I have to group by vendor ID and vendor name. Vendor ID and vendor name are very likely unique, but whether they are or not, I mean, there probably won't be two vendor names that are the same, but if they were, they would definitely have different vendor IDs.
But in this subquery, you didn't have to have that as D, right? That part.
Yes, I do. And I think you'll notice over here in the notice that this one, I put him in red and I put this in red. That says that these are not optional. So before, if you didn't say, if I didn't say as my max, I would just get a no column name. But when you're using it as a derived table here, then you have to name all of the fields. Let's go back to it and take a look at it. So this is necessary. This guy right here, if I did not have this, I would get, for my reading pleasure, an error message. I think I'm going to get an error there. See, he's throwing errors now, saying something's wrong with that. So select vendor name. Now, why do we use this? The idea here is that I need the vendor ID in this query because I might have duplicate vendor names. Are you with me?
Yes.
There's nothing stopping the vendor name from not being a duplicate. So I got IBM, FBI, all of those guys, but what would stop me from having two vendors? Since I'm spanning the whole United States, I could very easily have two vendors that have the same name. Wouldn't be unusual at all, particularly if it were a person. So this could be like a client name, the max of the payment total, but the client has I need to put in the client's social security number to make sure that what happens if I have two names that are the same?
And you check for duplicates?
I need to check for duplicates, but I don't want duplicates. I want that to be a different record because I'll have two different, if the names are the same, I want to be able to tell them apart, so I have to pull the social security number. But the social security number is privileged information, confidential. I'm not allowed to release the social security number. So the main reason for having something like this when you have a subselect in the from line is to hide this vendor ID. I have to have the vendor ID. Think of it like the social security number. So this social security number, this is the person's name, this is some number that I'm interested in. So when I group by, I have to group by the vendor's name. I would be just as happy to group only by the social security number. But since I'm printing the name, it has to also be in the group by. Okay. Now, when I finish with this, I'm going to go up here and this outer select will hide the data in the inner. So outside of this query, this vendor ID, this simulated confidential information is hidden.
So you could drop that vendor ID from there and also group by.
If you did, then there would be no reason to have a subselect. So if you dropped it from here, and then of course dropped it from the group by, there would be no reason to have this outer select because everything vendor name my max, vendor name my max, everything you're selecting here is going to the outer query. So there's no particular reason to have a subquery. I'm pretending that this is confidential information. And that is one of the uses for a what we call this is called a derived table. So it is a subselect. What our book calls a derived table. You don't see it. You don't see that language used much, but it's a subselect that is found in the from clause. So when I run this whole thing, I'm going to get, notice I got 32 rows here. So vendor name and the max. When I execute the whole query, I still get 32 rows, but now I have hidden the vendor ID. So the vendor ID is not in the output set at all. But he has to be there in the inner one to validate that I don't have two vendor names that are the same. I think maybe I'll go into the data and put two vendor names that are the same.
I see that. It has to, vendor ID has to be there, otherwise in the subquery you won't be able to compare on the on clause.
Right. If I had two vendor names that were the same, they would collapse into one row. But once I put the vendor ID in there, the vendor ID is guaranteed to be unique.
Okay.
I'm going to put a little bit more time. I'm going to run out of time because I see I'm out of time now, and I do have an appointment tonight. A derived table may participate in a table join, so it would be perfectly possible to have from as D, and then it would be perfectly possible to go on and, you know, inner join some table.
Now, can the subqueries be layered? Can there be another subquery underneath this?
Oh my goodness, yes. And you can really get wild with these things. Right now, I'm just trying to demonstrate. Right now, I've given you two subqueries. I've given you, you can have a subquery in the from, and you can have a subquery in the where clause. Most commonly, you'll find them in the where. So most commonly, you use a subquery to find the minimum or the maximum where you want ties. That's where that's just really meat for a subquery. The less commonly you see them in the from line, and most of the time here they're used to hide information or I'll talk about a use for a subquery later on in some of the next modules where I need to hide something from the outer query. On the next time we meet, and I would like for you to read it in the textbook prior so you have some idea. I would like you to look at, now Dr. King, I think Dr. King's lecture is actually better than mine. I'm going to go back over his, I'm going to use his a lot. Where's this covered in the textbook? Let me grab my textbook here. This is the idea of correlated subqueries, COR. 196, 197, and 202 and 203. Um, 196 and 197 are the ones is the reading that's, I think, and then further than that, page 202 and 203. And by all means, view Dr. King's lecture on it. So I'm going to refer you to his lecture. It is here in the page 4, and there's a link to Dr. King's lecture. So I'm going to go listen to his lecture. He has a very good one, and so he's very understandable, and I personally learn a lot from him and his style. So I've tried to adopt a lot of stuff from him. He's and he, by the way, he has a YouTube channel, and I recommend it. Notice I've linked a lot of his stuff. Anyway, I'm going to talk about correlated subqueries. I'm out of time. We're hitting 7 o'clock right now, so I'm going to push off the correlated subqueries as being the most complicated ones. So we've seen subqueries in the where clause, which is the most common. A little bit less common is subqueries in the from clause, and then we're going to see the big kahuna coming up here next time. Questions?
Yeah, well, I have one question from previous lecture, and it is simple.
Go ahead.
When you use distinct,
yes,
can you use on more than one field? If I do group by 2 fields, can I do distinct on 2? I tried to, and it didn't let me.
Select. Do you mean like where I say select distinct?
Vendor ID and invoice total.
I think once you say distinct, I think the distinct comes right after. I think if you state like that, we get 19 rows.
Can I put another distinct in front of the invoice total?
Well, it helps if I spell it right. When you say distinct, it applies to the whole line. So it comes right after the distinct, it comes right after the select line. And it says that this pair is distinct. So if you have a vendor ID and an invoice total that are the same, they're going to get collapsed into one. So when you say distinct, it's select, distinct, and the distinct applies to everything after it.
Okay.
So you don't say distinct vendor ID, comma, distinct invoice total. It's that record, that row is either distinct or you're allowing duplicate. In this case, we're not going to have duplicate vendor IDs. Let's see.
Because when you have group by in 2 things, so there are 2 sets of number, there may be repetition.
Yeah, if you do group by with 2 numbers, so if you have group by, for example, city and state are the ones that I typically use as an example. Okay. Group by vendor city, comma, vendor state. If I just said group by vendor city and I had 2, I was talking about Las Vegas, so I have Las Vegas, Nevada, and I have a Las Vegas in New Mexico. The Las Vegas is going to collapse into one field. If I say group by vendor city, comma, vendor state, then Las Vegas, Nevada, and Las Vegas, New Mexico will be 2 different groups.
Right. Okay. Yeah, the use of distinct. Again, has to be the
distinct is the default. So if you don't say distinct, you get distinct. So if you just say what would I have? Like select, for example, select.
I mean, if it is the primary ID, everyone is distinct.
Well, yes, but let's select terms ID from. And what is that? Invoice line items.
Okay.
So I believe that will. Don't I have where's terms ID?
Terms ID is in the terms.
I know it's in the terms, but which one is? I thought it was in invoice line items as a foreign key.
No.
Okay, is it in the invoices? Yeah, terms ID. Okay, so let's. It's not a. From invoices. Well, that was good. Okay, select terms ID from invoices. So when I execute this, and I get 113 rows. And notice I have one there that's null. So I get lots of duplicates in there. If I were to say select distinct, terms ID from invoices. So I got 113 rows that way. So as soon as I put the distinct in there and I say execute, now I only get 6 rows. There's only 6 different ones that are in there. What else? Let's see. What else can I have in here? Okay, vendor ID. Let's add to this example terms ID vendor ID, and we won't and so notice I've got a lot of, I got 3, 123, 3, 123, 3, 123. So I've got a lot of duplicate in there. If I put the distinct in there.
Okay. No, spelling.
Yeah. I don't know why I can't spell that. As soon as I put the distinct will apply to the entire row. And so, so what was it, 3 and 123? So there's 3 and 123. I only get 1 row of 3, 123. So the distinct applies to everything after it. It's not a distinct terms ID. It's not a distinct vendor. And so if I have 10 fields in there, then it will apply to all 10 of them as a group. That's what the distinct means.
Okay. To make terms ID, vendor ID distinct, terms ID has to be repeated. That's what it is done.
Well, there's no way to make terms ID distinct without also making the vendor ID distinct.
I see. Okay. All right. Yeah. Okay.
I have to go take a phone call right about now, but if there are any other questions, or I can come back in a few minutes.
No, we'll talk about it Tuesday. I turned in my 7 assignment. Just in case.
Okay. Well, I haven't. I haven't graded today, so.
Okay. And the one you have returned for me, I'll work on it. I have another test coming in another class.
Okay. Well, as far as that goes, you have the time that you need to do it, and I guess I'm going to, let's see, I'm going to end the recording now. So the recording is now ending on July 5th, 2018.